Access and Authorization. Hello everybody, this is Ben Finkel, and in this nugget we're going to take a look at how you can set up access and authorize users to connect to your MySQL database inside of Google Cloud SQL. This is distinct and separate from administering your database in Google Cloud SQL. This is actually accessing the database so that you can start creating tables, inserting data, doing the things with your database that you need to do on a regular routine basis. Once you've created some SQL instances, you're going to want to access them. After all, you don't want them to just sit there and do nothing. You created them for a reason, so you can use them. But when you try to access them from the outside world, I'll call it, outside of the Google Cloud Platform, you're going to run into a roadblock, and that includes any third-party application that you might be running elsewhere on your own data center, on your own system, etc., but also Google Compute Engine. Commonly, you're going to want to access these things from GCE. Well, you're going to run into a roadblock by default if you try to access your instance from these things. And the reason for that is because by default, your SQL instances are not visible to the outside world. They don't have an external IPv4 address. You have to go ahead and reserve one that you can use to connect to your database with. And you can do it when you create your instance, or you can do it after the fact. But you need that IPv4 address, that external address, associated with your instance so that third-party connections have something to connect to. Now these addresses, these IPv4 addresses, have a small idle charge. When you reserve an IP address, but your instance is idle, you're going to accrue a tiny charge. Right now it's a penny an hour. And that's just to discourage people from reserving a lot of addresses and never using them. You also have the option to use IPv6. The IPv6 address is actually by default always automatically assigned to your instance. It's always available, and it's free of charge. That's because there's so many IPv6 addresses in the block that you don't have to worry about discouraging people from reserving them. So you always have a way to connect to your SQL instance via IP using an IPv4 and IPv6 address. Importantly, Google App Engine can see your database without that IP address. Google App Engine actually connects directly to your Google Cloud SQL instances using the instance ID. So something like my example here, rubberseal768 : my instance. You have to use that full ID that includes both the project ID : database ID, and that's because your database IDs are not globally unique, they're only unique within the project. So that's how you get a unique ID for the whole SQL instance. Setting up this access is very easy to do. You can do it in the Developers Console simply by going to the Access Control tab and choosing Request an IP address. That's if you didn't set one up when you created the instance. Down in the Google Cloud SDK, using the command line operations, you can use it with the Assign IP switch. I've indicated it right here, both during the Create command or during the Patch command. So either when you create your instance or after the instance has already been created, you can patch your instance and assign it an IP address. Now, it's not just enough to set up that access point, to create that pipeline between your database and the outside world. You also have to authorize access. You have to allow users to access this database. And if you watch the nuggets on creating and managing Google Cloud SQL instances, you didn't see that going on. You didn't see us setting up that authorization. And that's because it's very important to distinguish accessing the database with administering the database. Administration for your Cloud SQL databases is done through the Google Cloud Authorization System. You authorize to the project itself, and that means administration happens over OAuth, right? So that was where you exchange a token and you log in with a user inside of your Google Cloud Platform product. And those users are managed inside of the Google Cloud project, totally separate from what we're talking about. What we're talking about is connecting to and using the database. We need access and connectivity to the actual database itself. We need database users. On top of that, even though we've set up an IPv4 access point, we've got that tunnel into our database from the outside world, the firewall by default blocks all incoming connections anyways. We can't connect to our database even using that IP address. So we need to whitelist external IP addresses that can access our database and set up users that they can use to connect. So at a bare minimum, what you need to do is you need to whitelist a single external IP address and set a root user password. By default, there's no root user password set, which means there's no user that can access your database. You have to log in as an administrator and set the root user password, and then you can whitelist your IP addresses and people can externally access the database. Now, the worst case scenario, the extreme opposite end of the spectrum, is that you would whitelist all IP addresses using CEDAR notation, 0.0.0.0, WAC 0, and in that case you would want to set up MySQL users and require SSL, because now any external IP address can theoretically connect to your database. You want to really lock down your security at that point. In reality, you're going to do something in between. You'll have some subnet, some collection of IP addresses, or maybe even only a single IP address if you're working through a proxy server, that you want to be able to access your database, and you'll create some users. You may or may not require SSL depending on the nature of the data that you're transferring around. And once again, all of this is different if you're connecting via the Google App Engine. Google App Engine instances are authorized by App Engine ID. So inside the user interface, you don't expose an external IP address. You simply tell the SQL database that an App Engine ID is allowed to connect to your database. As is frequently the case inside of the Google Cloud Platform, it's easy to configure and set up these things. Inside of the Developers Console, just go to the Access Control tab of your instance, and you can see you've got the option to set your root password, add authorized networks, authorize App Engine apps, and even configure SSL if you need to do that. Down at the Google Cloud SDK inside your command line, it's also easy to use the create or patch command and simply pass in the appropriate switches, authorized GAA apps, authorized networks, and if you need to set the root password, that's actually a different command other than create or patch. It's set root password, and then you pass in the password that you want to set it to. So very easy to do inside of either utility. So now you're ready to connect to your instance. You've created your access point, you've authorized users, you've whitelisted IP addresses. How do you connect to your instance? Well, very simply, the same way you would connect to any MySQL database. You can use the IP address that you set up and use something like MySQL Workbench. Just plug in your IP address, use your root password, or if you set up some other users, you can connect as those users. Or you can use any kind of client library in whatever your favorite programming language is. Here's an example of Python code, and it's the same thing. I'm just setting up a user, password, use the IP address, and connect right to the instance. There's a number of different connectors for connecting to MySQL in just about any language you can imagine. Also, if you're going to connect via your Google App Engine app, then you don't need that information. You can actually use the socket command for your instance name to connect directly to it without your IP address. As long as your App Engine app is allowed to connect to this database, you're going to get right in and be able to work with your database. That concludes this nugget on access and authorization. We took a look at how to set up and create access points for your database from external connections, whether it's a third-party tool or Google Compute Engine, and also how to authorize users, whitelist IP address, and create users such as root that can connect to your database and work with the database software. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.